This tale unfolded in the year 1891, when the town of Brazil in the state of Indiana attempted to wear the garments of progress while its soil remained married to older, far stricter laws. This occurred in the United States of America, although such a designation does little to persuade the land that it belongs to anyone. The hill at the edge of that rural settlement never yielded to flags or counties. It yielded only to numbers. In those days, the Gilded Age shimmered in distant cities, yet in Brazil the glow dimmed before it reached the ground. People laboured without the illusions enjoyed elsewhere, and the cemetery that crowned Carpenter's Hill became a quiet reminder that certain places choose their own pace. I will show you how that hill counted the living with the patience of something that neither erred nor forgave. It measured men and women with a precision that revealed more than they wished revealed. As you witness these events, remember that steps are never merely steps. They are declarations of intention, and the hill listened to each intention with exquisite care. You may believe you would climb differently from those you are about to meet. The hill would disagree. Carpenter's Hill had been shaped by years of indifferent weather, whose rains and winds had carved a slope that grew more severe with each passing decade. The cemetery at its crest appeared to lean forward, as though observing the town with a weary vigilance that no amount of sunlight could dispel. Even in summer, the grass upon the hill carried a pallor that unsettled those who walked the road below. It seemed incapable of accepting warmth. The headstones obeyed gravity reluctantly, settling at odd angles that suggested the soil beneath them shifted for reasons unrelated to time. The residents of Brazil spoke of the hill with the guarded caution of those who sensed old stories lingering beneath the surface. They would have ignored the whispers entirely if not for the peculiar events that had gathered around it for years. Travellers paused at the base of the hill, unsettled by the sense that something took notice of them when they drew near the cemetery gate. The gate itself, a rough iron structure forged without skill or artistry, possessed the curious ability to dissuade even the boldest visitor from crossing it. Those who did so often felt their confidence diminish the moment they placed a foot upon the incline. The story of the hill began with a man who believed he understood the earth better than it understood him. Roland Pierce had inherited his father's disdain for superstition, yet he carried a private fear that the ground might one day reclaim him as swiftly as it had reclaimed the man who raised him. Roland's father had been crushed in the collapse of a coal seam when Roland was still a boy. The townspeople called it an accident, but Roland sensed something heartless in the earth that had accepted his father without protest. His mother followed soon after, undone by a grief that the community quietly dismissed. This left Roland with the belief that death rewarded no one with dignity unless someone offered it deliberately. He became a gravedigger not from necessity, but from a strange desire to impose order upon the chaos that had shaped his youth. He dug graves with the reverence of someone attempting to reason with an unresponsive God, and he tended the cemetery as though apology might persuade the land to behave more gently. The steps up the hill became his daily ritual. He counted them with the solemn precision of a prayer. Each number represented a promise to remain vigilant, for he believed that those who miscounted the hill eventually paid for it. Roland understood better than anyone that the hill possessed a will that resisted simplification. He sensed the slope adjusting beneath him on certain mornings, and he grew accustomed to subtle impressions in the soil that resembled footprints without identity. He ignored these signs with deliberate stubbornness, for he feared acknowledging them would summon consequences he lacked the courage to confront. The morning of his death began like any other. He carried his lantern, shovel, and quiet dread with habitual resignation. The hill greeted him with an unfamiliar heaviness, as though the soil had thickened overnight. Roland climbed with increasing unease, counting beneath his breath in a rhythm that soothed him. He did not expect the final step to betray him. When his lantern fell, the flame died instantly. When he fell after it, something far colder than gravity seemed to claim him. When the townspeople discovered his body at the base of the hill, they remarked on the unnatural arrangement of his limbs. His neck had twisted at an angle that implied intent rather than accident. The ground around him bore no prints except his own. His eyes remained open, fixed not upon the sky or the broken lantern, but upon the path he had ascended every day of his life. They appeared as if caught in the act of counting. County officials dismissed the rumors surrounding his death, insisting that no cemetery could possess motives. Yet the residents of Brazil understood that Roland's fall marked the first moment the hill had shown its arithmetic openly. It had measured him for years, as it measured all who climbed it, and they feared the tally it kept did not exist for their comfort. As winter approached, whispers spread more quickly than the frost. People spoke of the hill as if it were a living ledger, documenting every intention that approached it. They wondered whether Roland had counted incorrectly, or whether the hill had finally reached the number it required from him. The distinction became irrelevant. What mattered was the awareness that the hill did not forget. It waited. The cemetery grew quieter in the weeks following his death, as though acknowledging the loss of a man who had treated it with unusual devotion. Yet the silence held a new weight. The steps seemed sharper beneath the frost, and the air along the slope carried a vigilance that unsettled even those who viewed the hill from a distance. The legend of the steps, once dismissed as rural superstition, began its slow, deliberate climb into the town's collective memory. What they could not yet know was that the hill counted far more than footsteps. It counted secrets, regrets, and unspoken motives, and it preserved each with a meticulous patience that outlasted the living. After Roland Pierce's death, the responsibility for the cemetery fell to Ephraim Greeley, a man who had never sought the role, yet accepted it with the exhausted resignation of someone who believed his life had already been weighed and judged by forces beyond his influence. Ephraim lived in a one-room cabin near the base of Carpenter's Hill, where the thin smoke of his stovepipe drifted each morning upward like a petition to a sky that seldom answered prayers. People said he kept to himself because he preferred solitude, but solitude had not been his original desire. It had been his punishment. Before the cemetery claimed him, Ephraim had worked at the sawmill, where noise filled every space with a violent steadiness that drowned out thought. He had once admired the certainty of machinery, believing that gears and beams remained honest even when people were not. That belief died the day he misjudged the weight of a shifting plank, causing it to slip from his grip and crush the arm of a man working beside him. Although the townspeople called it misfortune, Ephraim felt responsible for the irreversible damage inflicted upon someone who had trusted him. Shame settled upon him with a heaviness he could neither lift nor ignore. He left the mill soon after the incident, compelled not by the expectations of others, but by the unbearable sense that he had been measured and found wanting. He accepted the role of cemetery keeper because it allowed him to tend those who could not be harmed further by his failures. The dead did not require confidence. They required care, which he could still provide. Ephraim believed that by tending to graves with humility, he might atone for the harm his hands had caused. The hill became his sanctuary and his judge. Each morning he climbed Carpenter's Hill with deliberate caution, counting each step with the same solemn devotion Roland once carried. Unlike Roland, Ephraim sensed that the act of counting never protected him. Instead, it revealed him. He believed the hill responded to intention rather than accuracy. If his motives faltered, if guilt clouded his breath, if doubt disrupted his rhythm, the steps shifted beneath him. He recorded the changes in an iron-bound book beside his narrow bed, though he never admitted this habit aloud. The book's pages contained uneven numerals, written during nights when he feared the darkness listened too closely. One afternoon, several townsmen visited his cabin to ask about the cemetery. They arrived with the uneasy swagger of men who hoped their collective presence would shield them from the truth they feared. They spoke to Ephraim with forced joviality, asking whether the rumors about shifting steps held any substance. Ephraim answered with the calm of someone who had long ceased expecting understanding. He told them the number changed according to the hill's temperament. He said nothing more, for he sensed their minds closing around his words with the eagerness of those desperate to misunderstand. The men exchanged nervous glances. Their uneasy laughter faltered when they realized Ephraim's tone carried no humor. They insisted the differences came from the stride or the weather, but their arguments weakened beneath their own fear. They left his cabin with quickened steps, careful not to look directly at the cemetery gate on their retreat. Something in Ephraim's steady voice had unsettled them, though none of them could articulate what. They felt as though the hill itself had overheard the conversation and waited to respond. Ephraim remained seated for a long while after their departure, aware that each man carried a motive he had not spoken aloud. Some wished to disprove the legend, some wished to fear it. Others wished to protect their sense of order by dismissing anything that threatened it. The hill cared for none of these motives. It recognized intention more clearly than truth. It measured each man who approached it, whether with curiosity, arrogance, or dread. That evening, Ephraim stepped outside to gather firewood and saw faint indentations near the first step. They resembled footprints too narrow and too long to belong to any living creature. The impressions formed a path that curved up the hill before vanishing midway to the crest. Ephraim knelt to examine them closely. The soil within the prints appeared compressed by weight, though he could not determine how something could stand so lightly and so heavily at the same time. The sight awakened an old memory he had tried to bury, the memory of the mill accident and the sensation of something irreversible slipping through his grasp. He rose slowly and returned to his cabin, the cold wind pressing against his back like a warning. He did not open his iron-bound book that night. He did not need to record the numbers the hill had whispered beneath his feet. He already knew the count had shifted again. He sensed that the hill had grown impatient, not with him specifically, but with the town's refusal to acknowledge what had been growing in its shadow. The next morning, the chalk lines he had once drawn upon the steps reappeared in his mind, though he had long since abandoned that method. The first time he marked the steps, he hoped to force consistency upon the hill. He believed the chalk would remain long enough for him to measure the truth. Instead, the marks vanished within hours, replaced by faint tracks that circled his work as though something had inspected and dismissed it. When he burned the remaining chalk, the flames struggled to rise, as if the air itself resisted the destruction of what the hill had touched. As weeks passed, the townspeople noticed Ephraim's steps grow slower, his face more lined with quiet contemplation. Some believed his guilt from the mill haunted him still. Others assumed the burden of tending a cemetery weighed upon him, yet no one understood the truth he carried. Ephraim had begun to suspect that the hill did not count the living out of curiosity. It counted to determine readiness, and each shifting number revealed how far the hill's intentions had advanced. Ephraim continued his duties with unwavering humility, yet the familiar path up Carpenter's Hill acquired a new gravity. The steps grew sharper beneath his boots, the air thickened around him. He sensed the presence Roland must have sensed on the morning of his fall, the subtle pressure that suggested a ledger being balanced. He did not speak of this to anyone. He did not request help. He did not flee. Ephraim believed his life had already been measured, and he accepted the possibility that the final tally would one day require him. He simply prayed that the hill would count him last. Margaret Alder arrived in Brazil during the waning days of autumn, when the last warmth of the season surrendered itself reluctantly to the crisp touch of approaching winter. Her journey had been long, and the jostling carriage ride had left her bones aching in ways that grief alone could not explain. She stepped onto the platform with the posture of someone who had learned to bear sorrow with dignity, even when it threatened to unmake her. Though strangers saw only a quiet widow in a black travelling coat, Margaret carried an interior world shaped by losses that had taught her to read landscapes with unsettling accuracy. She had grown up under the stern influence of a mother who believed that sorrow offered a clearer education than joy ever could. Her mother insisted that cemeteries were books written in stone, and that only the attentive could decipher the truths hidden within them. Margaret spent her childhood walking among graves, observing the layout of burial grounds as if they were secret alphabets, waiting to be spoken aloud. Her mother guided her with patient severity, teaching her that the dead revealed the moral character of the living more reliably than living people ever revealed themselves. Margaret absorbed these lessons deeply, cultivating an intuition that unsettled those who encountered her later in life. She married a man whose gentle nature surprised her, for she had not expected kindness to seek her out. Their marriage offered a rare equilibrium, a balance between her sombre intuition and his steady optimism. His death in a lumber accident ruptured the fragile sense of safety she had cultivated. She refused to bury him in her home county, insisting instead on travelling to Brazil, where distant relatives believed the burial would be more fitting. Margaret did not articulate her reason for this insistence, though she felt a pull toward the land that she could not explain. Something in the soil of Indiana seemed restless, as if awaiting a witness who could understand it. When she reached Carpenter's Hill, she paused at the iron gate that marked the entry to the cemetery. The gate was unremarkable, yet Margaret sensed an intention within its rusted frame. She placed her hand upon the cold metal and felt the faintest tremor, as though the iron carried the residue of unrecorded footsteps. She lifted her gaze toward the crest of the hill, and the incline revealed itself with a severity that unsettled even her seasoned intuition. The grass along the slope did not sway with the wind. It appeared to be listening. Ephraim Greeley approached with cautious respect, his movements deliberate, as though he feared startling something unseen. He introduced himself softly, offering condolences with the sincerity of someone accustomed to grief. Margaret studied his eyes and recognized the weight of regret behind them. She sensed that his presence upon the hill was not merely occupational, it was penitential. She accepted his guidance, though she did not require it. She had already sensed the mood of the land. On her first ascent, Margaret counted each step with a calm precision that unsettled Ephraim. She did not count out of superstition, but out of courtesy, for she believed the hill expected acknowledgement. When she reached the crest and declared that she had counted exactly 100 steps, Ephraim hesitated before warning her that the number should not be trusted. Margaret did not contradict him. She simply stated that the hill had chosen honesty for her arrival. She knew the truth of this without needing to explain it. The land often revealed itself differently to those who understood its language. During the burial of her husband, Margaret noticed that the air near the grave felt unnaturally still. Wind passed through the nearby pines, yet refused to cross the boundary where the open earth lay. The stillness carried the tension of withheld breath. When she lowered her gaze, she saw faint indentations circling the grave. Shallow depressions, arranged with deliberate spacing like steps taken by something with a peculiar gait. The impressions did not resemble human footprints. They resembled observation. She did not ask Ephraim for an explanation, for she recognized the look in his eyes when he noticed them as well. He knew more than he wished to share. She sensed that the hill had been measuring his sorrow for years, and that the presence watching the burial had assessed both him and her with equal scrutiny. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She did not fear it, but she understood it. That evening, she returned alone to speak a final farewell to her husband. Dusk stretched across the horizon with a sombre grace, casting long shadows along the slope. When she reached the first step, she sensed immediately that the incline felt different. The ground no longer accepted her weight with the same balance. She ascended again, counting with the same quiet dignity as before. This time, the hill offered a different number. 91, 92, 93. Her breath thickened as the air grew heavier, carrying a strange cold that felt less like temperature and more like intention. When she reached the top, she sensed a presence behind her. She turned with the slow, deliberate caution of someone who had learned not to startle the unseen. The path below remained empty. The presence dissolved, replaced by a whisper so soft it resembled soil shifting beneath the weight of careful footsteps. She understood that the hill had counted her. It had added her to the ledger. The residents of Brazil witnessed her departure with a mix of pity and apprehension. Margaret boarded the train with calm composure, but her eyes carried an unspoken warning. She told the station master that the dead should remain below the earth, and that any hill which behaved otherwise ought never to be trusted. Her words lingered in the station long after the smoke of the departing train vanished from sight. The townspeople pondered her warning for months, though none admitted aloud that her quiet certainty unsettled them. They sensed that Margaret Alder had understood something essential about Carpenter's Hill, something the rest of them feared to consider. And although they attempted to dismiss her insight, they could not shake the feeling that the cemetery at the crest possessed motives that no one fully comprehended. The hill, as always, listened. Thomas Greeley was a child shaped by questions that pressed against his thoughts with a force that never eased. He inherited no part of his father's caution, nor the weary humility that defined his uncle Ephraim. Instead, he carried a restlessness that made him scrutinize every story adults attempted to conceal behind gentle warnings or abrupt silences. The world fascinated him, not because it was safe, but because it refused to explain itself. Thomas believed that knowledge offered strength, and that curiosity proved courage. He did not yet understand that some truths revealed themselves solely to diminish those who sought them. He spent long hours near the edges of Carpenter's Hill, watching Ephraim ascend and descend with the solemnity of a man walking between confession and consequence. Thomas noticed every detail. He saw how Ephraim paused before placing his first step, how his breath steadied as if bracing for judgment, how he seldom looked anywhere except the ground beneath him. Adults called it carefulness, but Thomas sensed fear woven into the rhythm of those movements. He had never been permitted to climb the hill, though he had asked repeatedly. Ephraim refused each time, with a tone that grew more strained as the boy matured. The refusal only sharpened Thomas's curiosity. He understood that adults often cloaked their fears inside rules, and he believed this rule carried meaning more profound than Ephraim wished to admit. He felt certain that if he could climb the hill and count the steps, he would discover whatever mystery the adults guarded so protectively. He imagined that uncovering the truth would elevate him beyond childhood. He did not realize the hill had never been interested in elevating anything. During the first frost of the season, when Ephraim worked in the lower burial plots, Thomas seized his chance. He approached the base of the hill with the fierce determination of someone attempting to prove that he should never have been underestimated. The sky carried the bruised shades of dusk, a color that magnified the strange emptiness of the cemetery above. The pines surrounding the hill shuddered in the wind, Yet the grass on the slope remained unnervingly still, as though it had been listening rather than swaying. Thomas placed his foot on the first step and began to climb. He counted aloud, his voice steady despite the cold pressing against his ears. Each step felt strangely consistent, as though the hill wished to encourage his ascent. As he climbed, he felt the peculiar thrill of defying a rule that had grown heavier with each year of his life. He imagined returning to Ephraim with the confidence of someone who had uncovered a secret meant for adults alone. His heart quickened with the arrogance of youth. When Thomas reached the crest, he expected to feel triumphant. Instead, a heavy stillness enveloped him. The headstones, arranged in uneven rows, cast elongated shadows that seemed to shift without wind. The silence pressed upon him with such intensity that he felt his throat tighten. He attempted to steady his breath, but the air seemed to resist him, as though it had been waiting for something, or someone. For reasons he could not articulate, Thomas felt compelled to stand completely still. He sensed the cemetery evaluating him, not with malice, but with unwavering scrutiny. He felt small beneath the gaze of countless stones that leaned toward him like listeners eager for confession. As he stared across the graveyard, he noticed faint depressions in the soil near several markers. They resembled tracks that circled the stones with slow deliberation. He attempted to reason through what could have made them, but his thoughts faltered, clouded by the inexorable weight of being observed. He forced himself to begin the descent, believing that returning to familiar ground would restore his confidence. He placed his foot upon the first downward step and began to count again. He anticipated the hill would mirror the ascent, offering the same number he had so proudly spoken aloud. Yet the steps passed beneath him more quickly than he expected. He felt his pulse quicken as the slope shortened. His numbers fell out of rhythm, and he began counting faster in a futile attempt to control the pace. 60, 61, 62. He reached the bottom long before he reached 100. Confusion struck him with such force that he stopped abruptly and turned. The hill stretched before him in a manner that felt both familiar and distorted. The grass along the slope trembled now, though no wind touched it. At the crest, where he had stood moments earlier, a figure had appeared. The figure held itself with a rigid stillness that defied natural posture. Its outline was subtly wrong, lacking the organic movement that signaled life. It stood as though it had been carved from the same soil upon which it rested. Its arms hung unbent at its sides, and its head tilted as if listening to something Thomas could not hear. His breath faltered. He blinked once, and the figure vanished. Thomas fled. His small boots pounded against the cold soil as he ran toward the cabin, the rhythm of his steps uneven with fear. He burst through the door, trembling so violently that his words collapsed into fragments of panic. Ephraim caught him by the shoulders and attempted to calm him, though his own hands shook despite his efforts. The boy could not articulate the fear that clung to him. He could only shake his head repeatedly and whisper that the hill had changed the order of his steps. Ephraim understood the meaning of this even before Thomas spoke the full sentence. He felt dread rise within him, heavy and corrosive. He realized that the hill had not merely counted Thomas, it had judged him. And in doing so, it had revealed that even the youngest could not escape its arithmetic. In the days that followed, Thomas withdrew from the world with anxious precision. The boy who once sought answers now avoided questions entirely. He flinched at shadows and refused to approach windows facing the cemetery. When asked to describe the figure he had seen, he struggled to form coherent sentences. He attempted to explain that the figure had not moved like a person. It had not stood like one either. It had stood like something practicing the imitation of being seen. The townspeople offered comfort that carried no weight, for they sensed a deeper truth behind the child's fear. They realized that the hill's attention had expanded. It no longer observed only those who worked among the graves. It had begun to measure those who merely wandered too close. The legend of the 100 steps grew roots that winter. They wrapped themselves around the minds of the townspeople and refused to release their grip. No argument rooted in reason could pry them loose. Something had awakened upon Carpenter's Hill, and it had no intention of returning to sleep. Sheriff Alton Reeves had built his life upon the conviction that strength was a discipline rather than a trait. He believed the world respected those who refused to bend beneath uncertainty, and he despised any sign of fear, especially in himself. His father had raised him with the relentless instruction that emotion weakened a man, and Alton had accepted that creed with the fervour of someone who feared disappointing a figure he could never satisfy. The sheriff wore authority like armour, believing that the appearance of certainty protected him from the chaos of the world. He had never understood that the land itself recognized no hierarchy. He viewed the growing unease surrounding Carpenter's Hill with increasing irritation. Whispers about shifting steps, ghostly figures, and the strange death of Roland Pierce spread through the town like a mild contagion of nervous imagination. Alton dismissed all of it. He believed the residents needed firmness, not indulgence. Any force that could be explained should be, and anything that could not be explained must be confronted until it yields. His approach to leadership relied on the belief that the world fell in line when a single man refused to bow to it. When Thomas Greeley's terror rippled through the community, Alton's patience fractured. He refused to accept that a cemetery could impose fear on the living. He believed the hill had become a symbol of weakness, and he considered it his duty to silence the superstition before it undermined the town's stability. Determined to re-establish control, he prepared to climb the hill himself. His confidence remained unshaken. Fear, he believed, infected only those who allowed it to enter through the cracks of their own indecision. He approached the cemetery at dusk, when the sky held a deep violet glow that blurred the horizon. His lantern swung from his hand with a steady rhythm, casting arcs of amber light across the ground. He walked with the rigid posture of a man convinced he would conquer whatever lay before him. The iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, and although the sound carried a warning tone, Alton interpreted it as nothing more than neglect. The air along the slope felt colder than it should, but he attributed it to the hour. He placed his boot on the first step with the resolute belief that intention alone governed the world. He counted loudly, as if daring the hill to expose any inconsistency. 1, 2, 3. His voice carried through the still air with unnerving clarity, as though the hill compelled silence to amplify his bravado. He ascended with unwavering rhythm, the lantern illuminating patches of grass that seemed unnaturally pale beneath the light. Alton refused to acknowledge the sensation of being observed, though he felt it prick against the back of his neck with increasing insistence. When he reached what he believed to be the crest, he stopped. The ground beneath him flattened, but the graves he expected to see were absent. He lifted his lantern higher and attempted to orient himself, yet the landscape appeared unrecognizable. The cemetery's stones had shifted to the periphery, their silhouettes distant and indistinct. A strange disorientation seeped into his mind. Alton hesitated, an unfamiliar tremor echoing through his chest. He refused to acknowledge it as fear. Determined to control the situation, he stepped forward again, believing that continuing would force the hill to reveal its boundaries. But the land seemed to lengthen beneath him, stretching in unnatural distance. His breath grew sharp in the cold air as he realized the incline had reassembled itself around him. He turned to descend, attempting to retrace his steps with deliberate calculation. But the numbers no longer aligned. The downward count failed to match the rhythm of his ascent. He felt the ground shift subtly beneath him, as though adjusting to his weight with unsettling intelligence. His lantern flickered, casting fragmented shadows that stretched across the slope like grasping silhouettes. Halfway down, he sensed a presence behind him. It approached with a slowness that suggested neither haste nor hesitation. The air thickened with a cold that pressed into his bones. His instinct urged him to turn, but something deeper, older than instinct, warned him that looking back would cost him more than his life. He kept his eyes forward, forcing his breath into a steady rhythm. 93, 92, 91. The numbers became a shield he clung to with desperate calm. The presence moved closer. He felt pressure at his shoulder, a weight that rested upon him without physical touch. The sensation stripped him of the illusion that authority held any value here. On Carpenter's Hill, he was no sheriff. He was a measured object, a quantity to be tallied, a single line in an arithmetic not created for human understanding. When he reached the final step, the pressure vanished. The air around him lightened with abrupt indifference, as if the hill had lost interest in him entirely. He stepped onto level ground with the unsteady gait of someone who had been briefly unmade and reassembled with imperfect precision. Alton straightened himself mechanically, adjusting his coat with deliberate calm. But something in his eyes revealed the truth he would never speak. The hill had counted him, and the count had not favoured him. He returned to his office without addressing anyone. He extinguished his lantern with silent finality and sat alone for hours, unable to reconcile what he had encountered. He avoided the cemetery afterward, though he insisted publicly that he had merely grown too busy to inspect it further. His authority no longer provided comfort. His certainty no longer held weight. Within a month, he resigned from his position. He relocated to another county, where no one asked him about Carpenter's Hill. The residents of Brazil whispered that the sheriff had finally learned what the hill demanded of those who attempted to control it: humility that did not come willingly. What none of them realized was that Alton Reeves left Brazil with a new understanding, one he would never confess. He understood that fear did not weaken a man, it revealed him. And when the hill revealed him, it recorded him with the same meticulous care it reserved for the dead. By early winter, the whispers surrounding Carpenter's Hill had evolved from nervous speculation into something more deliberate, more structured, almost like a quiet doctrine whispered from one household to another. People who once dismissed the cemetery as ordinary now crossed the road to avoid walking too near its incline. Mothers urged their children not to stare at the crest, claiming it was impolite to watch what might be watching back. The minister, who had once tended the graves, vanished one night without ceremony, leaving behind only a half-written sermon and a home stripped of anything resembling comfort. The town attempted to ignore these absences, but each missing presence pressed into their consciousness with growing insistence. It was in this uneasy climate that a group of men decided to impose order upon the legend. They approached the problem with the smug determination of those who believed that numbers submitted to rulers and rulers submitted to reason. These men were carpenters, surveyors, and self-appointed experts in the workings of the physical world. They believed with sincere arrogance that the hill's unruly arithmetic could be corrected through measurement and logic. They gathered their tools as if preparing for battle, not with weapons, but with the delusion that the land could be disciplined. Their leader, a surveyor named Lawrence Thatch, had built his reputation upon the fantasy that the earth yielded to instruments. His father had taught him that accuracy defined a man's worth, and Lawrence had absorbed that lesson with the zeal of a devotee. He believed that mismeasurements were moral failures, and that precision purified the uncertain. He approached Carpenter's Hill not with fear, but with indignation. He felt personally insulted by reports of shifting steps. If the land behaved inconsistently, then it threatened the foundation upon which he had built his self-worth. He gathered 5 men to assist him, each possessing their own motives. Samuel Hart, a carpenter with trembling ambition, hoped to earn respect by proving the legend false. Harold Wilkins, a young surveyor's apprentice, craved validation from Lawrence and believed helping measure the hill would secure it. Peter Dovell, a land assessor with a taste for bravado, joined only to ridicule the townspeople's fear. Only one among them, a quiet teacher named Elias Crow, approached the task with the solemn dread of someone who sensed they were acting against wisdom. He had studied folklore in his youth and recognized the pattern unfolding in Brazil. Places that demanded humility seldom tolerated intrusion. The men climbed the hill with tools slung over their shoulders, carrying stakes, rope, and iron markers. The sky hung low with the promise of snow, and the air carried a heaviness that felt less like weather and more like expectation. Lawrence instructed the men to mark each step with a stake so the count could be verified. The others nodded, though each felt a faint tightening in the chest, as if the hill acknowledged them individually. The first 10 steps passed without incident. The men worked with growing confidence, marking each point with deliberate precision. But as they advanced, subtle inconsistencies emerged. The distance between stakes that should have been equal was shifted by imperceptible increments. Samuel paused at the 15th stake and noticed the rope between 2 markers sagged at a strange angle, as though the land beneath had lowered itself. He mentioned it quietly, intending only to note an anomaly. Lawrence dismissed him with an irritated wave, insisting the rope had stretched. By the 30th step, Harold felt a pressure beneath his boots, a sensation like the ground adjusting to account for his weight. He stepped again and felt the same subtle shift. He attempted to mention it, but Peter laughed loudly and accused him of trembling in the shadows. Elias, who had been watching the men more closely than the hill, noticed how each jibe was laced with unease. Their bravado had begun to collapse beneath the quiet scrutiny of the land. When they reached the 50th stake, Elias knelt to examine the soil. The ground appeared compacted, but the compaction did not match the pattern of human footsteps. It resembled the imprint of something that moved with mechanical deliberation, pressing only where the step required, leaving no extraneous disturbance. He felt the hair along his arms rise. He whispered to Lawrence that they should reconsider. The surveyor silenced him sharply, his voice cracking with more fear than anger. At the 70th step, the men fell silent in unspoken agreement. The slope had subtly changed. The incline steepened, and the grass thinned, exposing soil that appeared darker than the earth below. The stakes they placed there sank deeper than expected. Samuel attempted to withdraw his hand from the soil and felt a momentary resistance, as if the earth hesitated before releasing him. When they finally reached what should have been the crest, Lawrence ordered them to count the stakes. They descended the hill together, tallying each marker with growing tension. By the time they reached the bottom, the truth revealed itself with cold indifference. The hill contained 101 steps. Not 100, not 98, not 103, 101. A number that divided their confidence neatly in half. A number that refused interpretation, a number that belonged to neither error nor clarity. It sat between expectation and dread, offering nothing but unease. Lawrence's jaw tightened. He attempted to rationalize the discrepancy, but every justification crumbled beneath the stares of the men who had witnessed the work. They returned to town in sullen silence, carrying their tools with the limp exhaustion of defeated soldiers. At dawn the next morning, Samuel returned alone to inspect the hill. He found the stakes gone. Every rope was removed, every marker vanished. The ground bore no sign of disturbance. It appeared as though no measurement had ever taken place. He fled the hillside, breathless and shaken. The residents of Brazil received the news with quiet horror. They did not question the disappearance of the stakes. They understood without explanation that the hill rejected the intrusion. They whispered that the land had considered the men carefully and had erased every trace of their arrogance. After that day, Carpenter's Hill became more than a legend. It became a presence. It measured the town with the same slow patience it used to measure steps. And through winter's approach, one truth settled over Brazil with the weight of a frost that refused to melt. The hill was learning, and it chose when to reveal its lessons. Ephraim Greeley had grown accustomed to waking before dawn, not because he enjoyed the early hour, but because silence felt easier to bear when the world remained unformed by daylight. In those dim moments, he could pretend that Carpenter's Hill was nothing more than a burial ground, and not a place that responded to intention with unnerving precision. Yet in the weeks following the Surveyors' failure, the hill's presence settled upon him with an insistence he could no longer ignore. It pressed against his thoughts with the steady weight of a truth waiting to be admitted. He had sensed for years that the hill regarded him differently from the others, not with hostility, but with careful study. The gravedigger's life had become a ledger of guilt and quiet penance, and Ephraim believed the land recognized such things too easily. His atonement had always been incomplete. The mill accident haunted him with a relentless clarity. He had watched another man's arm shatter beneath a falling beam because his own grip had faltered. Though the townspeople absolved him, Ephraim never forgave himself. He believed that the dead deserved a keeper who understood failure intimately, someone who would approach each grave with reverence born from remorse rather than duty. The hill recognized this remorse. Ephraim sensed it in the way the slope shifted beneath his feet, adjusting itself like a living thing, turning toward a familiar voice. The presence that frightened others did not frighten him in the same way. It unsettled him, certainly, but it also acknowledged him. He felt watched, not as prey, but as something being evaluated for a task he had not yet understood. As winter deepened and the frost clung stubbornly to the ground, Ephraim realized the hill had begun to anticipate him. On mornings when his resolve wavered, the steps felt steeper, carrying the weighted patience of a reprimand. On days when he moved with humble clarity, the incline softened, granting him an ascent that felt almost merciful. He never spoke of these changes. The hill, he believed, granted its reactions privately. It did not perform for crowds. Ephraim's iron-bound book had grown heavy with numbers, each entry documenting the hill's shifting count. He could not remember why he continued writing them, only that something compelled him to preserve the record. The numbers formed patterns that eluded him, rhythms that hinted at a truth he sensed but could not articulate. Some nights he woke with the impression that the hill had whispered to him, though he never heard words. The communication felt like a presence brushing against the edge of his consciousness, steady and solemn. He began to dream of the man he had harmed at the mill, not as he had known him in life, but as a hollow figure carved from soil and shadow. In these dreams, the figure stood upon the hill with an unnatural stillness, turning its head toward him with a question that carried no spoken language, only weight. Ephraim believed the dreams were not punishment. They were reminders. The hill measured his guilt with exquisite care. One evening, after a day spent repairing a weathered fence near the lower graves, Ephraim noticed a faint indentation near the first step. It resembled the partial impression of a heel, though too elongated to belong to a human foot. The soil within the depression seemed darker, as though it had been compacted by an impossible density. He placed his hand near the imprint and felt a coldness emanating from it, thicker than the evening air. He stood slowly, understanding the message with instinctive clarity. The hill was growing impatient. He returned to his cabin and sat beside the stove, staring at the iron-bound book without opening it. A terrible calm settled over him. He knew then what the hill had always intended. It had been waiting for him, not as a victim, but as an acknowledgement. It had observed his sorrow, his humility, his attempts at atonement, and had decided that the time for measurement had reached its conclusion. Ephraim felt the realization not as terror, but as an exhausted acceptance. The hill had evaluated him not with cruelty, but with inevitability. He prepared for what must come. He cleaned his boots with deliberate care. He washed his hands in cold water until they tingled from the sting. He retrieved his lantern, though he sensed he would not need its light. The hill, he believed, would provide what illumination was required. Ephraim stepped outside into the heavy quiet of early night. The air held the brittle scent of frost, and the sky hung low with clouds that obscured the stars. He walked toward the cemetery gate with the solemnity of someone approaching confession. When he lifted the latch, the iron groaned in recognition. The sound felt almost ceremonial, as though the gate marked the beginning of a ritual. He placed his foot upon the first step. 1. The hill responded instantly, not with movement, but with attention. Ephraim felt the presence gather around him, neither threatening nor protective. 2. His breath steadied, his steps grew rhythmic, each one measured with reverence. 3. The cold air thickened as he climbed, settling around him like a mantle. He felt neither fear nor hesitation, only acceptance. At the 20th step, the wind shifted with a low moan that carried through the grass, though the grass itself did not move. At the 40th step, he felt a tremor beneath his boots, subtle yet intentional, as though the hill acknowledged his progress. At the 60th step, he sensed something falling into place, like a lock turning to receive its key. When he reached 70, the soil shifted more noticeably, not with instability, but with purposeful adjustment. Ephraim paused, understanding the significance. The hill had grown accustomed to his weight, his remorse, his steady breath. It reshaped itself now, preparing for the final measure. He continued. 95, 96, 97. At 98, he felt a presence behind him. Its nearness pressed into the air, altering the space around his shoulders. He did not turn. He sensed that the presence did not want confrontation. It wanted acknowledgement. 99. The silence became absolute. 100. Ephraim stepped onto the crest. The cemetery unfolded before him with the deep stillness of a place holding its breath. He felt no triumph in reaching the top. He felt instead the quiet weight of recognition. He walked toward the nearest grave, and as he leaned closer, the inscription caught his breath in his throat. His own name, chiseled with the same careful hand he used for every stone. The wind exhaled in a single low sigh. He turned. The presence he had felt now stood before him, coalescing from shadow and soil, shaped not into a human form, but into the idea of one. A figure without face or breath, held together by the gravity of memory. It regarded him with an attention that felt ancient and patient. Ephraim closed his eyes. He understood that the hill had finished its count, and the count required completion. He did not descend again. Ephraim Greeley's disappearance did not announce itself with spectacle. No cries pierced the night. No strange lights pierced the frost-heavy sky. The hill simply absorbed him with the same elegance and inevitability with which it absorbed everything that lingered too long under its gaze. But his absence spread through Brazil like an ache beneath the ribs, subtle at first, then persistent, then impossible to ignore. The town had lost men before, farmers to accidents, children to illness, wanderers to winter, but this loss carried an unspoken finality that everyone recognized and no one wished to name. When Ephraim failed to appear at dawn, the residents first assumed he had taken ill. When he failed to appear by noon, a quiet dread settled over the community. By evening, a search party assembled, though each man felt the unarticulated burden of knowing precisely where their steps would lead them. They moved toward Carpenter's Hill with lanterns held against the encroaching dark, their breaths forming pale clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold. At the base of the hill, they hesitated. The incline seemed steeper than it had the day before, as though the land had drawn itself farther from human reach. The men exchanged uneasy glances before ascending with the forced determination of those who suspect they are participating in a ritual rather than a search. Their lanterns cast trembling halos of light along the slope, revealing nothing unusual, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no trace of a man who had simply vanished. When they reached the crest, the graveyard greeted them with its familiar, oppressive stillness. The headstones stood in their crooked rows, their inscriptions softened by frost. The men called Ephraim's name with the hollow bravado of people who hoped sound alone might ward off fear. Their voices drifted across the cemetery and vanished without echo. The hill swallowed their calls with a silence that felt unmistakably deliberate. Only one thing disturbed the scene. Near a freshly filled grave, one that should not have existed, lay a single footprint pressed deeply into the soil. It bore the shape of a man's boot, yet the depth of the imprint suggested a weight far greater than Ephraim's. The sight unmade the composure of even the bravest among them. They stared at the footprint, unable to reconcile its meaning. It was a presence without direction, a step without a sequence, a record without an origin, and it stood alone, as if the hill had chosen to leave behind only the trace of its decision. No other sign appeared, no broken branches, no disturbed fence, no drag marks. Nothing suggested Ephraim had ever walked away from the grave he had tended with such somber devotion. Some men insisted he must have wandered into the woods, disoriented by cold or exhaustion. Others whispered that he had finally succumbed to the guilt that had haunted him for years. But none dared climb the hill again to verify their theories. The cemetery gate remained closed the next morning, as though it had no intention of opening for anyone not already claimed. The town grew still in the days that followed, its residents retreating into their homes earlier than usual, locking doors that had previously remained unlatched. Conversations shifted away from the hill, not because people wished to forget, but because they feared the hill listened when spoken of too boldly. Yet even in silence, the legend continued its expansion. Some heard counting at night, soft, rhythmic, neither hurried nor slow. It came on the wind like a chant spoken from beneath the earth, rising and falling with a cadence that suggested both patience and inevitability. Others awoke with the sense that someone had stood near their window, not close enough to touch the glass, but close enough to observe them with curiosity. A few children reported dreams of walking up the hill, only to awaken with dirt beneath their fingernails and the memory of numbers they could not bring themselves to repeat. The presence that had once confined itself to the cemetery began to bleed into the town's collective imagination. People measured distances differently. Footsteps gained weight. Paths, once walked without thought, now felt significant. Travelers passing through Brazil paused instinctively at the base of the hill, as if the land compelled them to consider whether they wished to be counted.
The town council debated relocating the cemetery entirely, but each discussion devolved into heavy silence. No one wished to approach the hill. No one wished to disturb whatever arithmetic had taken root there. Even those who prided themselves on practicality found themselves unable to return to the slope. They feared the hill would view their presence not as defiance, but as presumption. Winter settled over Brazil with a severity that matched the solemn mood of its people. Snow blanketed the landscape, yet Carpenter's Hill remained strangely exposed, its grass untouched by frost even when every field for miles wore a cloak of white. The land around it bowed beneath winter's weight, but the hill stood unaltered, its surface betraying no trace of season or time. Residents whispered that the hill had chosen its own climate, its own rhythm, its own rules. Rumours deepened into certainty when a traveller passing through town attempted the climb, unaware of the legend's strength. He returned pale and shaken, unable to speak coherently. His ascent, he later managed to explain, had been simple. His descent had been impossible. Each step he attempted led him not downward, but sideways, as though the slope wished to redirect him, reorder him, reinterpret him. He claimed he had heard someone counting beneath his feet, not with malice, but with unsettling precision. The townspeople did not ask him to clarify. They understood that the hill had merely continued the work it had begun long before Ephraim Greeley's final climb. Carpenter's Hill no longer needed witnesses to sustain its legend. It had become a presence woven into the fabric of Brazil's identity. It counted not only those who climbed it, but those who thought of climbing it. It counted fears, it counted motives, it counted intentions half-formed and quietly dismissed. And it did not forget. The cemetery at the crest stood as a ledger written in stone and soil, its entries carved not by hand but by footsteps, hesitations, and the silent arithmetic of a place that had outlasted those who attempted to measure it. What remained most unsettling was this: the hill did not appear finished. It counted as though waiting for someone specific, someone not yet born or not yet bold enough to climb. It waited with the patience of a force unconcerned with the span of human life. And in Brazil, where winter pressed against shuttered windows and fear settled into every hearth, people learned to speak of the hill only in murmurs. They understood at last that the cemetery did not react to the living. It tallied them.
The hill in Brazil, Indiana, continues its count without hesitation, without mercy, and without the slightest concern for whether anyone believes in the arithmetic it keeps. It tallies the living with the same patience it uses to preserve the dead, and it never miscalculates. Every life that brushes against it becomes another line in a record that predates the town, the country, and the year 1891 when these events unfolded. You have now witnessed how a man's guilt shaped his ascent, how a widow's intuition revealed truths the hill did not bother to conceal, how a child's curiosity opened a path he could not escape, and how an officer's pride dissolved beneath the weight of a presence that recognized no authority. You've seen that the hill does not hunger for victims. It hungers for honesty. It counts intentions with greater accuracy than footsteps, and it waits for those who believe they can control the measure. Now that you have walked through these pages, the question becomes yours to answer. If you were to stand at the base of Carpenter's Hill, if the iron gate opened for you as it opened for those before, what number would rise beneath your feet? What would the hill learn from the way you climb? What would it record in its quiet arithmetic when you reach the crest? If you wish to leave your mark below, you may do so. The ledger accepts signatures from those who recognize the weight of a story that refuses to rest. Whether the hill notices is uncertain, although I suspect it observes more diligently than most living eyes. I watch. I remember. And now, viewer, you carry the memory as well.